Struggling to get things done isn't a lack of discipline, it's a perception trap. Discover how to break free and make progress feel effortless. The Infinite Productivity Hack. Audiobook. Introduction. The struggle is painfully familiar. You stare at your to-do list, feeling the crushing weight of uncompleted tasks pressing down on your shoulders. Important projects remain untouched while smaller tasks multiply like weeds. Each morning brings fresh determination, yet somehow the day slips away, leaving a trail of unfulfilled intentions. The cycle repeats, motivation surges, then crashes against an invisible wall of resistance. Self-doubt creeps in, whispering accusations of laziness and lack of discipline. This experience is universal, cutting across all walks of life. High achievers and novices alike find themselves caught in this peculiar trap, where knowing what needs to be done seems completely disconnected from actually doing it. The pattern is so common that we've accepted it as normal, building entire industries around solving this apparent deficiency in human nature. But what if everything we believe about productivity is wrong? What if the very assumptions underlying traditional approaches are actually keeping us stuck? This isn't another book about time management techniques or motivation hacks. Those approaches, while well-intentioned, often deepen the real problem by reinforcing a fundamental misperception about the nature of action itself. The truth is, you're not lazy. You're not broken. You're not lacking in willpower or discipline. You're trapped in a perception prison that makes action feel heavier than it actually is. This distortion creates artificial weight and resistance, where none naturally exists, transforming simple tasks into daunting mountains that must be climbed. Throughout these chapters, you'll discover how this perceptual barrier operates and, more importantly, how to dissolve it. You'll understand why traditional productivity advice often backfires, and why trying harder typically leads to doing less. You'll explore concepts like the weight illusion, how our minds create artificial heaviness around actions, and the momentum paradox, where effort itself becomes the obstacle to progress. This journey isn't about adding new strategies to your productivity toolkit. It's about removing the invisible barriers between intention and action. It's about discovering that productivity isn't something you do through force or discipline, but something you allow by clearing the path for your natural state of flow to emerge. When these perceptual barriers dissolve, something remarkable happens. Doing becomes as natural as being. Action flows effortlessly like water finding its path downhill. This isn't some mystical state reserved for elite performers. It's your natural way of functioning when you're free from the weight of misperception. The path ahead isn't about becoming more productive through force of will. It's about discovering that you already are productive by nature, once you see through the illusions that make action feel heavy. Welcome to a journey of unlearning, where less becomes more, and effort gives way to ease. Chapter 1. The Weight Illusion. Picture yourself sitting at your desk, staring at your to-do list. There's a simple task waiting to be done: sending an email, making a quick phone call, or organizing a small stack of papers. Objectively, it would take just minutes to complete. Yet somehow, this tiny task looms before you like an immense boulder that needs to be pushed uphill. Your energy drains at the mere thought of tackling it, and what should feel light as a feather instead feels like a crushing weight on your shoulders. This experience of disproportionate heaviness around simple actions is so common that we've accepted it as normal. We rationalize it through stories about motivation, willpower, or discipline. But there's a deeper truth hiding in plain sight. Tasks themselves have no inherent weight. They only carry the weight our perception assigns them. When you look closely at any task that feels heavy, you'll notice something fascinating. The actual physical or mental energy required to complete it is often minimal. Instead, what creates that sensation of heaviness is the invisible meaning our minds layer onto the action. These layers might include anticipated consequences, emotional associations, or complex webs of related thoughts and concerns that automatically attach themselves to the task. Neuroscience reveals how our brains create this experience of effort. When we perceive a task, our neural networks don't just process the bare mechanical requirements. They automatically activate associated memories, emotions, and potential outcomes. This creates what scientists call cognitive load, the mental equivalent of carrying extra weight. The more meanings and associations we attach to a task, the heavier this invisible burden becomes. Think of tasks as empty backpacks. The actual backpack, the core action required, might weigh almost nothing. But our perception fills these backpacks with invisible rocks, self-judgment, fear of failure, anticipated stress, imagined negative outcomes, or the weight of past similar experiences. We then mistake this perceptual weight for the task's inherent difficulty. This weight feels undeniably real. You can feel it in your body as tension, in your mind as resistance, in your emotions as dread or overwhelm. The sensation is authentic, but its source isn't the task itself. It's the perceptual layers we've unconsciously wrapped around it. Consider how the same task can feel radically different when stripped of these perceptual layers. Making a phone call to schedule an appointment might feel overwhelming when wrapped in layers of social anxiety, anticipated awkwardness, and concern about disrupting your day. But in an emergency, when these perceptual layers drop away, you can make that same call without a second thought. What makes tasks feel unnecessarily heavy in your life? Notice which actions trigger a disproportionate sense of effort or resistance. What meanings might you be attaching to these tasks? Are you loading them with consequences far beyond their actual scope? Are you wrapping them in layers of self-judgment or perfectionism? The relationship between perception and effort operates constantly in our lives, often below our conscious awareness. Every task we face is filtered through these perceptual layers before we experience it. This filtering process is so automatic that we mistake its effects for reality itself, like wearing tinted glasses for so long that we forget we're seeing the world through a colored lens. This understanding forms the foundation for a radical shift in how we approach productivity. Tasks are weightless until perception makes them heavy. This isn't just a metaphor. It's a practical insight that opens the door to a completely different relationship with action. When we recognize that the weight we experience isn't inherent to the task itself, we gain the ability to examine and potentially release these perceptual layers. This perceptual weight isn't created randomly or without reason. Our brains have evolved to approach change and action with automatic protective responses, a survival mechanism that served our ancestors well but often works against us in modern life. These protective instincts, while essential in a world of physical threats, now manifest as resistance to growth and transformation in your daily experience. Your mind automatically flags unfamiliar actions as potentially dangerous, coating them with layers of perceived difficulty that have nothing to do with the actual effort involved. What might be a simple email becomes a mountain to climb, not because of its inherent challenge, but because your brain's ancient warning system has tagged it as a potential threat to your safety and comfort. Chapter 2. The Resistance Reflex. You've experienced this countless times. The moment you decide to take action on a task, an invisible force seems to emerge from nowhere, pushing back against your intention. Despite your clear decision to act, you suddenly feel an overwhelming urge to check your phone, clean your desk, or do literally anything except the task at hand. This resistance feels like a weighted blanket dropping over your motivation, making even the smallest action feel impossibly difficult. This automatic response to action isn't a character flaw or lack of discipline. It's a biological reflex deeply wired into your brain's operating system. What you're experiencing is your brain's ancient survival circuitry responding to potential change in your environment. This response developed over millions of years when any change could signal life-threatening danger, and it continues to activate today even when the threat is just sending an email or starting a workout. Your brain's primary directive is keeping you alive, which historically meant conserving energy and avoiding risks. From this perspective, maintaining your current state is always safer than change. Any new action represents uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers protective responses in your limbic system, the emotional center of your brain, before your rational mind can even assess the situation. This is why logically knowing you should do something often isn't enough to overcome the resistance you feel. Your limbic system has already activated its protective response before your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, can evaluate whether the action poses any real risk. It's like having an overzealous security system that triggers a full lockdown when a leaf blows across your yard. Think of this resistance mechanism as an overprotective guard dog. Its intention is noble, keeping you safe, but its threat assessment capabilities are stuck in prehistoric times. Just as a guard dog might bark frantically at both dangerous intruders and harmless mail carriers, your brain's resistance response activates whether you're facing actual danger or just the mild discomfort of starting a new project. The sensations of resistance are genuinely uncomfortable. The sudden fatigue, the racing thoughts, the strong urge to procrastinate. These feelings are real physiological responses created by your nervous system. However, understanding that these sensations are simply your brain's automated warning system rather than accurate indicators of threat or inability changes everything. This resistance is actually useful information, like a dashboard light in your car. When the check engine light comes on, you don't panic and abandon your car on the roadside. You acknowledge the signal while rationally assessing whether immediate action is needed. Similarly, resistance is just your brain's check engine light for change, a notification to be acknowledged, not an emergency brake to be obeyed. When you recognize resistance as a natural notification rather than a barrier, its power to stop you diminishes significantly. Just as you might say, "Thanks for letting me know," to your car's warning light while continuing to drive. You can acknowledge your brain's protective response while moving forward with your intended action. Pay attention to how resistance manifests in your own experience. Does it show up as physical sensations like sudden fatigue or tension? Does it appear as a flood of distracting thoughts or a compelling urge to do other tasks? Does it trigger specific avoidance behaviors like checking social media or reorganizing your workspace? Understanding your personal resistance patterns helps you recognize them as automated responses rather than meaningful obstacles. This biological response isn't defective. It's actually operating exactly as designed to maintain homeostasis and protect you from potential threats. The issue isn't the response itself, but rather the context in which it's operating. Your brain is running ancient survival software in a modern world where most changes you want to make pose no actual threat to your survival. Resistance isn't a wall you must break through with force. It's a messenger delivering outdated information about risk. The message was vital when changes could mean life or death, But in today's environment, it's more like an overactive spam filter flagging important emails as threats. This understanding transforms how you relate to resistance. Rather than fighting against your own protective mechanisms or becoming frustrated by their persistence, you can appreciate their intended purpose while recognizing their limitations in your current context. Resistance isn't an enemy to be defeated, but an overeager ally to be gently redirected. Chapter 3. Motivation. Mythology. You sit at your desk, watching minutes turn to hours as you wait for that elusive spark of motivation to arrive. The task before you is important, perhaps even urgent, yet you remain frozen, believing you need to feel ready before taking action. This pattern has played out countless times, waiting for the perfect emotional state, the right energy level, or that mythical surge of inspiration that's supposed to propel you into action. This seemingly logical approach, waiting to feel motivated before acting, represents one of the most pervasive and damaging myths in modern productivity culture. It's a belief so deeply ingrained that questioning it feels almost counterintuitive. Yet this conventional wisdom completely reverses the true relationship between feeling and doing, creating a perpetual trap that keeps you stuck in inaction. The reality, supported by extensive research in neurochemistry and behavioral psychology, is that motivation isn't the precursor to action. It's the product of it. Your brain's reward chemicals, particularly dopamine, aren't primarily released in anticipation of action. The substantial releases occur during and after taking action. This is why waiting for motivation is fundamentally flawed. You're waiting for something that can only be generated through the very action you're postponing. Studies in behavioral activation therapy have consistently demonstrated that action precedes emotional change, not the other way around. Depressed patients who engage in small activities, even without any initial motivation, experience significant improvements in mood and energy. This isn't because they waited until they felt better. It's because taking action, however small, triggered the neurochemical cascade that created those positive feelings. Think of motivation like starting a car. You wouldn't sit in your driveway waiting for the car to start moving before turning the key. Yet this is exactly what you do when waiting for motivation before taking action. The engine of motivation requires the key turn of action to start running. Once started, the engine generates its own momentum, but that initial spark must come from action itself. This insight isn't just modern psychology catching up to reality. It's a rediscovery of timeless wisdom that ancient philosophers and successful individuals throughout history have observed. The Greeks spoke of praxis, action, preceding gnosis, knowledge. Contemporary research has simply provided the neurological explanation for what great achievers have always known intuitively. Action creates its own motivation. The discomfort you feel before taking action is completely normal. Your brain, designed for survival in a very different environment, interprets any change in state as potentially threatening. This triggers a resistance response that feels like lack of motivation. But this response isn't a signal to wait. It's simply your brain's automated caution system doing its job. The key insight is that this feeling isn't meant to be waited out. It's meant to be moved through. When you examine your own experience, you'll likely recognize countless instances where motivation arrived after you started, not before. Think about times you've dreaded starting a workout but felt energized once you began, or how projects that seemed overwhelming became engaging once you took the first step. These weren't coincidences. They were demonstrations of the action-first principle at work. The implications of this understanding are profound. Instead of asking, "How do I get motivated?" the real question becomes, "What small action can I take right now?" Rather than trying to generate the right feeling, focus on generating the right action. The feelings will follow naturally, creating a positive feedback loop that builds genuine, sustainable motivation. This represents a complete reversal of the conventional motivation narrative. Instead of motivation being the prerequisite for action, it becomes the reward for action. This shift transforms motivation from something you wait for into something you actively generate through deliberate engagement with your tasks. The power in this reversal lies in its simplicity. You no longer need to solve the puzzle of finding motivation before you begin. Your focus shifts entirely to identifying and taking that first small step, knowing that momentum will build naturally from there. By breaking free from the need to feel motivated first, you liberate yourself from one of the most common barriers to progress and growth. This liberation carries profound implications. You're no longer at the mercy of fleeting emotional states or waiting for the perfect surge of inspiration. Each small action becomes a catalyst, sparking a chain reaction of progress that builds upon itself. The simple act of beginning, regardless of how you feel in the moment, puts you firmly in control of your growth trajectory rather than leaving it to the whims of motivation. Chapter 4: The Momentum Paradox. You face your computer screen, feeling utterly drained at the thought of the work ahead. The mere contemplation of the tasks waiting in your inbox seems to sap what little energy you have left. This sensation is so familiar. The weight of anticipated effort crushing your vitality before you've even begun. Yet hidden within this universal experience lies one of the most profound insights about human psychology and productivity. What you're experiencing illuminates a fascinating paradox about psychological energy, one that challenges everything you intuitively believe about how motivation and energy work. The anticipation of effort actually requires more mental energy than the effort itself. Your brain, in its attempt to protect you from potential energy expenditure, creates a simulation of the work that ironically demands more resources than simply engaging in the actual task. This phenomenon aligns perfectly with fundamental principles of physics, specifically Newton's first law of motion. Objects at rest tend to remain at rest, while objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Your psychological energy operates under remarkably similar principles. The resistance you feel before starting isn't indicative of the energy the task will require. It's simply the force needed to overcome initial inertia. Research in neuroscience and psychology consistently demonstrates this counterintuitive truth. When studying flow states, those periods of energized focus where time seems to disappear, scientists have found that the brain actually becomes more efficient once fully engaged in an activity. The neural networks involved in task execution require less energy than the networks active during task contemplation and worry. Think of psychological energy like a water wheel in a flowing stream. When stationary, the wheel appears to conserve energy. After all, it's not expending any effort. But it's only when the wheel begins turning that it generates power. The very motion that seems like it would deplete energy actually creates it. This same principle applies to your psychological state. The engagement itself generates the energy you need to continue. This understanding has been reflected in wisdom traditions throughout history. Ancient philosophers and modern psychologists alike have observed that vitality emerges through action, not rest. While physical fatigue operates on a depletion model, where rest is genuinely needed to replenish energy, psychological energy often works in reverse. The more you engage, the more energy becomes available to you. The implication of this truth is profound. Waiting to feel energized before starting is as backwards as waiting for a water wheel to generate power before letting it turn. The very act of engagement is what creates the energy you're waiting to feel. This explains why the hardest part of any task is often just beginning. You're fighting against psychological inertia, not actual energy depletion. What makes this especially challenging is that the fatigue you feel in anticipation of action is absolutely real. Your brain's simulation of effort creates genuine sensations of exhaustion, but this fatigue is more like a false alarm than an accurate signal of your energy capacity. It's your mind's protective mechanism overshooting its role, trying to conserve energy you don't actually need to save. This insight transforms how you can approach any task. Rather than treating your initial feeling of fatigue as a signal to wait for more energy, you can recognize it as simply the resistance of psychological inertia. Just as a rocket uses most of its fuel, overcoming Earth's gravitational pull, the majority of your psychological energy is spent in the act of starting. Once in motion, maintaining action requires far less energy than you expect. The moments when you feel most drained by the thought of starting are precisely when this principle becomes most valuable. Instead of interpreting that sensation as a sign to wait, you can recognize it as proof that you're caught in the contemplation phase, where your brain is unnecessarily draining energy by simulating effort. The fastest way to restore energy isn't to rest, but to shift from thinking about action to taking action. This reality flips the conventional energy-action equation on its head. Energy isn't a prerequisite for action. Rather, action is what generates energy. Each small step creates the momentum that makes the next step easier, building a self-reinforcing cycle of engagement and vitality. Understanding this transforms your relationship with productivity, revealing that the energy you seek isn't something to wait for. It's something you create through the very actions you've been hesitating to take. Chapter 5. The Time Distortion Effect. When you finally tackle that task you've been avoiding for days or weeks, something peculiar often happens. The dreaded email response takes 5 minutes. The intimidating phone call lasts 3 minutes. The overwhelming project requires just 30 focused minutes to complete. In that moment of completion, you're left wondering why your mind magnified these tasks into such insurmountable mountains. This perception-reality gap reveals one of the most significant insights about procrastination. Our brains systematically and predictably distort the time requirements of emotionally charged tasks. This isn't a character flaw or lack of time awareness. It's a documented psychological phenomenon that affects everyone, regardless of their time management skills or experience level. The science behind this distortion is fascinating. Research in cognitive psychology demonstrates that when we associate negative emotions with a task, our temporal perception becomes significantly warped. Studies have shown that we typically overestimate the duration of avoided tasks by 300 to 500%, meaning that something that actually takes 15 minutes is perceived as requiring an hour or more when we're in avoidance mode. This distortion operates through multiple psychological mechanisms working in concert. The planning fallacy, first identified by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, shows how we consistently underestimate the time needed for future tasks, while paradoxically overestimating the time required for tasks we're currently avoiding. Emotional forecasting errors cause us to project our current feelings of resistance into the future, making us overestimate both the difficulty and duration of avoided tasks. Think of your perception as a lens through which you view time. When you're avoiding a task, this lens becomes warped in two distinct ways. It magnifies the time required for the avoided task, while simultaneously shrinking your perception of available time. This double distortion creates a seemingly impossible equation. The task appears to require more time than you could ever have available. The impact of this distortion extends beyond individual tasks. When you perceive tasks as requiring significantly more time than they actually do, you naturally postpone them in search of a mythical, perfect time when you'll have enough time to tackle them. This perpetuates a cycle where tasks pile up, creating even more emotional charge and time distortion. What makes this phenomenon particularly challenging is how real these distorted time estimates feel. Your brain presents them with absolute certainty. This will take hours. You don't have enough time. It's too big to start now. These feelings are so convincing that even past experiences of similar tasks taking less time fail to correct our future estimates. The temporal distortion effect becomes even more pronounced with tasks that carry emotional weight or uncertainty. Responding to a difficult email might objectively require 10 minutes, but if you're anxious about the interaction, your brain might present it as an hour-long ordeal. The more emotional charge a task carries, the more severe the time distortion becomes. Temporal discounting, our tendency to overvalue immediate rewards and disproportionately discount future benefits, adds another layer to this distortion. When we're avoiding a task, our brain amplifies the immediate discomfort of doing it while minimizing the future benefits of completion. This skewed cost-benefit analysis makes postponement feel rational in the moment, even though it often leads to greater stress and time pressure later. This distortion doesn't just affect how we perceive individual tasks. It influences our entire relationship with time and productivity. When we consistently overestimate task duration, we develop a distorted sense of our own capabilities and capacity. We begin to see ourselves as less efficient than we actually are, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where we take on less because we think everything will take longer than it actually does. The key to breaking free from this distortion lies not in better time management techniques, but in understanding and accounting for this perceptual warping. Your estimates about avoided tasks are not objective measurements. They're emotionally inflated projections that rarely match reality. The next time you find yourself putting off a task because it feels too time-consuming, remember that this perception is being filtered through the distorting lens of procrastination. Time expands to fill our dread and contracts to meet our action. This isn't just a poetic observation. It's a fundamental truth about how our minds process time when we're in avoidance mode. The solution isn't to fight this distortion with willpower, but to recognize it as a predictable perceptual illusion that dissolves upon engagement. This understanding leads us to a crucial insight about productivity. The way we perceive progress itself can create additional barriers to action. Our tendency toward binary thinking, seeing tasks as either complete or incomplete, with no value assigned to partial progress, creates yet another perceptual distortion that we must address. Chapter 6. The Binary Illusion. You wake up late, missing your planned morning workout. In that moment, a familiar thought pattern emerges. I've already ruined my perfect streak. This week is short. I might as well start fresh next Monday. By evening, you've abandoned not just today's exercise, but your entire fitness routine. This pattern repeats across different areas of life. One missed study session leads to dropping the course. One delayed task spirals into abandoning the whole project. One dietary slip transforms into a week-long binge. This destructive cycle stems from a fundamental misperception about the nature of progress. Your brain, seeking simplicity and certainty, defaults to binary categorizations. success or failure, on track or off track, perfect or worthless. This black and white thinking creates artificial cliffs that transform minor setbacks into total derailments. The reality of progress contradicts this binary perspective. Scientific research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that sustainable change follows a nonlinear pattern, a series of advances and retreats that, viewed from a broader perspective, trend upward over time. When tracking long-term success stories in any field, perfection never emerges as a defining factor. Instead, resilience and consistency in returning to the path prove far more decisive. This insight reveals a profound truth. The greatest threat to your productivity isn't imperfection. It's your response to imperfection. A single missed workout doesn't erase your previous gains. A delayed task doesn't negate your prior progress. These are merely data points in a larger progression, significant only in how you interpret them. The fallacy becomes clear when we examine real-world navigation. While driving, a wrong turn doesn't prompt you to abandon your destination or wait until next week to resume travel. You simply recalculate and continue. Yet in productivity, we often treat minor deviations as total system failures, creating self-fulfilling prophecies of abandonment. Research in cognitive psychology illuminates why this happens. Your brain's negativity bias assigns disproportionate weight to perceived failures, while confirmation bias selectively notices evidence supporting your initial abandonment impulse. This creates a psychological trap, where imperfection becomes proof of inadequacy rather than a natural part of progress. The cost of this binary thinking extends beyond individual setbacks. Each abandonment reinforces neural pathways of all or nothing responses, making future derailments more likely. More insidiously, it creates a hidden fear of success. Because if perfection becomes the only acceptable standard, even minor progress feels threatening. This explains why seemingly motivated individuals repeatedly sabotage their progress. The pressure of maintaining perfect execution creates such psychological tension that abandonment provides relief. The temporary comfort of giving up becomes preferable to the sustained discomfort of imperfect progress. Understanding this mechanism reveals why traditional advice about staying motivated or pushing through often fails. These approaches address symptoms rather than the root cause, the binary thinking pattern that transforms natural variations in performance into existential threats to progress. The solution lies not in trying harder, but in seeing more accurately. Progress isn't a binary state of perfect or worthless. It's a continuous spectrum where every action adds value, regardless of sequence or timing. This shift in perception transforms setbacks from catastrophic failures into natural feedback that guides adjustment. When you view progress through this lens, fascinating possibilities emerge. A missed morning workout becomes an opportunity to experiment with evening exercise. A delayed task becomes a chance to refine your approach. Each imperfection becomes data that informs your next step rather than evidence that condemns your entire journey. This perspective shift doesn't just make progress more sustainable, it makes it more enjoyable. Without the constant pressure of perfect execution, you're free to explore, adjust, and evolve your approach. The energy previously spent maintaining an illusion of perfection becomes available for actual progress. Your path forward emerges through this new understanding. Progress doesn't require perfection. It requires continuation. Every return to the path strengthens rather than weakens your trajectory. Each adjustment builds rather than diminishes your momentum. This isn't motivational rhetoric. It's the documented reality of how lasting change occurs. Progress lives in the gray area between perfect and worthless, in the countless small decisions to continue despite deviation from the ideal. Your productivity journey transforms when you embrace this truth, allowing the natural ebb and flow of progress to carry you forward rather than sweep you away. Chapter 7. Identity Friction. You stare at your calendar, knowing you should schedule that important presentation preparation. Every logical part of your mind recognizes its importance. Yet something deeper creates an inexplicable wall of resistance. The mere thought of detailed planning makes your energy drain away, despite your conscious desire to be thorough and prepared. This resistance isn't random. It emerges from a subtle but powerful force, your self-concept. That quiet voice whispering, "I'm more of a spontaneous person," or "I'm not detail-oriented," creates genuine neurological barriers to action, regardless of your rational intentions. The human brain operates on a fundamental principle of consistency. When actions align with our self-image, they flow naturally with minimal resistance. But when actions conflict with how we see ourselves, our neurology creates friction, not out of malice or laziness, but as a protective mechanism maintaining our sense of self. Research in identity-based motivation reveals how deeply this mechanism runs. Studies show that simple self-descriptive statements like, "I'm not a morning person," or "I'm bad with numbers," create measurable changes in brain activation patterns when attempting related tasks. Your brain literally processes these activities differently, based on whether they feel congruent with your identity. This explains why traditional productivity advice often fails. Trying to force yourself to adopt habits that conflict with your self-concept is like trying to force puzzle pieces from different sets together. The resistance you feel isn't weakness. It's your brain's natural response to perceived identity incongruence. The impact of self-concept extends far beyond conscious awareness. Even when you logically want to take action, statements like, "I'm not the type of person who," create invisible walls that feel insurmountable. A person who sees themselves as creative but disorganized will experience genuine resistance to systematic approaches, while someone who identifies as analytical but inflexible may struggle with improvisation, regardless of their actual capabilities. The neuroscience behind this phenomenon reveals why it feels so visceral. Your brain processes identity-conflicting actions in the same regions associated with error detection and cognitive dissonance. This triggers stress responses and emotional discomfort that makes sustained behavior change extremely difficult. However, this same research offers hope by revealing the remarkable plasticity of self-concept. Your identity isn't fixed. It's constantly being shaped and reshaped by your interpretations of experience. Small shifts in how you describe yourself can create dramatic changes in which actions feel natural versus forced. The key lies in understanding that identity acts as a filter, not a wall. When actions align with self-concept, they pass through effortlessly. When they conflict, resistance emerges. But this filter can be adjusted through subtle shifts in self-narrative. Consider how differently these statements feel. "I'm trying to become organized," versus "I'm developing my natural ability to create order." The first creates friction by implying change against your nature. The second suggests alignment with existing qualities, reducing resistance. This understanding transforms productivity from a battle against yourself into an expression of who you are. Actions that previously felt like forcing square pegs into round holes begin to flow naturally when reframed as authentic expressions of identity. Think about areas where you experience inexplicable resistance. What identity beliefs might be creating that friction? How might small shifts in your self-concept open new possibilities for effortless action? Pay attention to your language around different activities. Phrases like, "I'm not good at," "I could never," or "I'm just not the type" signal identity barriers that may be creating unnecessary resistance. Question whether these beliefs accurately reflect your capabilities or merely your current self-concept. The most powerful shifts often come from subtle adjustments rather than dramatic reinvention. Instead of trying to become a completely different person, look for ways to expand your existing identity to naturally encompass desired actions. This isn't about positive thinking or self-deception. It's about recognizing the profound impact of self-concept on action and consciously choosing identity framings that create alignment rather than resistance. Consider how your current self-concept serves you. Which aspects create flow and which create friction? What small expansions in how you see yourself might dissolve resistance around important actions? Action flows naturally when it feels like an expression of who you are, not a contradiction. This core truth points to identity alignment as the path of least resistance toward meaningful change. This relationship between identity and action reveals why the societal definitions of productivity often create additional layers of internal conflict. A critical dynamic we'll explore in the next chapter. Chapter 8. The Productivity Distortion. You rush through your day checking off tasks, responding to emails, meeting deadlines. Yet that gnawing sense of inadequacy persists. Each accomplishment brings momentary relief before the pressure to do more resurfaces. Despite working longer hours and being more productive than ever, you feel perpetually behind, measuring yourself against an invisible standard that keeps moving further away. This endless chase for productivity isn't a personal failing. It's a symptom of a deeper cultural condition. Our society has transformed productivity from a means to an end into an end itself, creating a toxic relationship with action that prioritizes quantity over quality, external validation over internal fulfillment. The roots of this achievement obsession trace back to the Industrial Revolution, where human value became increasingly tied to measurable output. Factory efficiency metrics gradually seeped into every aspect of life, creating an implicit equation between worth and productivity. The digital age has intensified this pressure exponentially, with social media and productivity apps turning every action into a trackable, comparable metric. This shift has profound psychological consequences. When productivity becomes a virtue rather than a tool, we lose touch with its fundamental purpose, to help us create value and meaning in our lives. Instead, action becomes driven by an insatiable need to prove our worth through constant achievement. Consider how metrics dominate modern life. Steps counted, likes tallied, productivity scores tracked. Each metric creates a new standard to meet, a new basis for comparison and inadequacy. The result is a society running ever faster on a treadmill of achievement, expending enormous energy without moving toward genuine fulfillment. Like a treadmill, this approach to productivity creates the illusion of progress while keeping us stationary. No matter how fast you run, you never reach your destination because the true destination, a sense of enough, isn't found in the metrics themselves. The treadmill keeps accelerating as society's expectations increase, demanding more speed, more output, more proof of worth. This cultural conditioning runs deep, creating genuine pressure to maintain ever-increasing productivity. Economic realities and social expectations can make it feel impossible to step off the achievement treadmill. But recognizing these pressures as external constructs rather than inherent truths creates space for a different relationship with productivity. True productivity isn't about meeting society's standards of success or keeping pace with others' expectations. It's about aligning action with personal values and meaningful goals. This alignment transforms productivity from an obligation into a natural expression of purpose. The solution isn't to reject productivity entirely, but to reclaim its definition. When actions flow from internal values rather than external pressure, the same tasks take on different meanings. Work becomes an expression of purpose rather than proof of worth. The contrast becomes clear when you examine motivation. Are you driven by fear of falling behind or desire to create value? Are your goals based on others' expectations or your own values? Does your productivity serve your life's purpose or society's metrics? These questions reveal the gap between culturally imposed productivity and authentic engagement with meaningful work. They highlight how external standards often override internal wisdom about what deserves our time and energy. Real productivity emerges when action aligns with personal values, when effort serves meaningful goals rather than arbitrary metrics. This alignment doesn't eliminate effort, but transforms its nature, from draining obligation to energizing engagement. The path forward requires conscious choice to measure success by internal standards rather than external metrics, to value quality of engagement over quantity of output, to define productivity in terms of meaning created rather than tasks completed. True productivity isn't doing more things, but the right things, those that matter to you, not just to others. This shift in perspective creates freedom from the achievement treadmill while maintaining purposeful engagement with meaningful work. The achievement obsession that dominates modern culture creates a particular kind of exhaustion, not just physical fatigue, but soul-level depletion from constant striving. Yet beneath this exhaustion often lie deeper fears driving our relationship with productivity. Chapter 9. The Fear Beneath. You sit at your desk, mindlessly organizing files, checking social media, or tackling minor tasks while that important project remains untouched. Each time your mind drifts toward it, an uncomfortable sensation rises. Not quite anxiety, not quite dread, but something that sends your attention scurrying toward safer activities. This pattern repeats day after day, the discomfort growing alongside the mounting pressure to act. What appears as simple procrastination masks a deeper emotional landscape that most productivity advice fails to acknowledge. The real barrier isn't laziness or poor time management. It's the unexamined fears lurking beneath the surface of avoidance. These fears operate like invisible puppet masters, directing your actions away from certain tasks while keeping their true nature hidden from your conscious awareness. Research in psychology reveals how the brain creates sophisticated avoidance strategies to protect us from perceived emotional threats. When facing a task that triggers deeper anxieties, your mind automatically redirects your attention toward less threatening activities. This protective mechanism operated beneath conscious awareness, making it particularly difficult to identify without intentional examination. These hidden fears take many forms. Fear of failure might manifest as perfectionism or endless preparation. Fear of success could appear as self-sabotage, just as goals come within reach. Fear of judgment might emerge as procrastination on visible projects while excelling at solitary tasks. Fear of confronting limitations could show up as chronic busyness that prevents deeper engagement. Think of your life as a house with many rooms. Procrastination represents those spaces you've learned to avoid. Rooms containing uncomfortable emotions, challenging truths, or memories you'd rather not face. Just as you might develop elaborate patterns to avoid entering certain physical spaces, your mind creates intricate routines to prevent engagement with tasks that might trigger these deeper fears. These avoidance patterns often originated as legitimate protective responses to past experiences. Perhaps early criticism made perfectionism feel necessary for survival. Maybe childhood instability made playing it safe seem like the only option. Understanding this protective intent helps release self-judgment while recognizing that these old strategies may no longer serve your current reality. The path forward begins with bringing compassionate awareness to these underlying fears. When you notice procrastination patterns, pause to examine what lies beneath the surface resistance. What feels threatened? What are you protecting yourself from? What story does this avoidance tell about your past experiences? The simple act of acknowledging these fears often begins to dissolve their power. When brought into conscious awareness, what felt like an overwhelming barrier often reveals itself as an old protection that's outlived its usefulness. This doesn't mean the fears instantly disappear, but rather that they can be engaged with directly, rather than unconsciously controlling your actions. Chronic procrastination around creative projects might reveal a deep fear of judgment rooted in early criticism. Avoidance of advancement opportunities could point to imposter syndrome stemming from childhood instability. Perpetual business might mask fear of stillness that would allow uncomfortable emotions to surface. Your relationship with these tasks transforms when you recognize procrastination as protection rather than personal failing. Each instance of avoidance becomes an invitation to self-discovery rather than evidence of inadequacy. This shift from judgment to curiosity creates space for new responses to emerge naturally. The key lies in approaching these fears with gentle inquiry rather than forcing them away. Ask yourself, what would it mean if I failed at this task? What might change if I succeeded? What part of me feels threatened by moving forward? Let the answers emerge without rushing to fix or change them. Consider how these protective patterns developed and what purpose they served. Rather than fighting against procrastination, honor the intent behind it while exploring whether that protection remains necessary. Often, simply acknowledging the fear with compassion begins to loosen its grip on your actions. This exploration reveals that procrastination isn't your enemy. It's a messenger pointing toward deeper needs and fears requiring attention. Behind every pattern of avoidance lies a protection that made sense in its original context, but may now be limiting rather than serving you. Chapter 10. The Avoidance Spectrum. Your productivity landscape reveals an intriguing pattern. Certain tasks flow effortlessly. Perhaps you zip through data analysis or creative writing without hesitation. Yet other activities, seemingly no more difficult or time-consuming, consistently trigger resistance. You might find yourself avoiding emails that require decisions while eagerly organizing files, or tackling complex technical challenges while perpetually postponing simple phone calls. This pattern isn't random. Each person exhibits a unique resistance fingerprint, a consistent spectrum of avoidance that reveals deeper psychological terrain. Understanding this pattern illuminates why traditional productivity advice often falls short. What works for others may fail for you, because their resistance fingerprint differs fundamentally from yours. Scientific research in behavioral psychology and neuroscience demonstrates how our brains develop specific avoidance patterns based on our individual psychological needs, past experiences, and core fears. These patterns manifest as consistent resistance to particular types of tasks, regardless of their objective difficulty or importance. Common resistance patterns emerge around specific task qualities rather than the tasks themselves. Some individuals consistently avoid ambiguity. Any task without a clear endpoint or defined parameters triggers automatic resistance. Others experience strongest resistance around social exposure, where actions might invite judgment or evaluation. Some find themselves avoiding complexity, tasks requiring multiple decisions or steps, while others primarily resist tedium, struggling with repetitive tasks that demand sustained attention. Your resistance fingerprint is as unique as your actual fingerprint, formed by the intricate interaction of your psychological makeup and life experiences. Just as a fingerprint has distinct patterns of whorls and ridges, your avoidance spectrum has peaks of maximum resistance and valleys where action flows naturally. This pattern operates below conscious awareness unless deliberately examined. You might notice yourself consistently postponing certain types of tasks without understanding why, or feel puzzled by your ability to tackle objectively challenging work while avoiding seemingly simple actions. The power of recognizing your resistance fingerprint lies in its revelation of your psychological comfort zones and growth edges. Like a topographical map, it shows where you naturally flow and where you tend to get stuck. This knowledge transforms vague productivity struggles into specific patterns that can be understood and gradually shifted. Your resistance patterns aren't random character flaws, but rather sophisticated protective mechanisms developed over time. While these patterns may have served important purposes in the past, they can become limiting when they no longer match your current reality and goals. The path forward isn't about forcing yourself through resistance, but understanding its specific contours in your life. When you recognize that you consistently resist tasks involving uncertainty, for instance, you can begin to see this as information about your growth edge rather than a personal failing. This understanding creates the possibility of gradually expanding your comfort zones through conscious engagement rather than brute force. Like slowly widening the banks of a river, you can incrementally expand where action flows naturally in your life. Your resistance fingerprint may include multiple overlapping patterns. You might find strongest resistance where multiple triggering qualities combine, like tasks that involve both social exposure and ambiguity. Understanding these intersections provides crucial insight into which situations are likely to trigger your strongest avoidance responses. Mapping your unique resistance patterns requires honest self-observation without judgment. Notice which specific qualities make tasks feel resistant rather than focusing only on the tasks themselves. Does your resistance spike with tasks requiring public visibility? Does it intensify around activities without clear completion criteria? Does it emerge strongest with tasks demanding sustained focus? This awareness creates choice where previously there seemed only automatic avoidance. Understanding the specific qualities that trigger your resistance allows you to approach challenging tasks strategically rather than repeatedly confronting the same walls. Your resistance has a pattern, knowing it is the first step to transforming it. As this understanding deepens, you'll begin seeing how your next chapter's exploration of perfectionism often interweaves with these core resistance patterns, creating particularly challenging combinations that require special attention. Chapter 11. The Perfectionism Paradox. You sit at your desk surrounded by carefully arranged materials, waiting for that elusive, perfect moment to begin. The lighting isn't quite right. Your energy level could be better. You haven't done quite enough research. There's a nagging feeling that you need just one more piece of preparation before you can start. Days pass, weeks pass. The project remains untouched, preserved in its theoretical perfection, never manifesting in messy reality. This pursuit of perfect conditions creates a peculiar form of self-sabotage. Neuroscience reveals how perfectionism hijacks our brain's reward systems, making the anticipation of potential imperfection register as a genuine threat. This triggers our avoidance responses, creating a physiological barrier to action that feels completely rational in the moment. Research in performance psychology demonstrates that perfectionism rarely stems from a genuine drive for excellence. Instead, it typically emerges from deep-seated fears about conditional self-worth and judgment. These fears create a protective mechanism that prevents us from engaging with any situation where we might produce imperfect results. The impact extends far beyond simple procrastination. Studies show that perfectionist tendencies correlate with lower overall achievement, decreased creativity, and reduced innovation. This creates the ultimate paradox. Those most committed to achieving excellence often produce less impressive results than those willing to engage in messy, imperfect progress. Consider the metaphor of a sculptor approaching a block of marble. The perfectionist sculptor stands before the stone, endlessly studying technique, reading about mastery, and waiting for the perfect moment when their skill will match their vision. Meanwhile, another sculptor begins making cuts, learning from each stroke, gradually developing their ability through direct engagement with the material. Years later, the perfectionist's marble remains untouched while the iterative sculptor has produced numerous works, each better than the last. This pattern plays out across every domain of achievement. Research in skill acquisition shows that excellence emerges through progressive approximation, getting closer to our target through repeated attempts and adjustments. Yet perfectionism demands we hit the bullseye on our first shot, creating an impossible standard that prevents us from even stepping up to the line. The psychological cost is equally significant. Studies indicate that perfectionist tendencies strongly correlate with anxiety, depression, and burnout. The constant pressure to achieve impossibly high standards creates a state of chronic stress that actually impairs the very cognitive functions needed for high performance. Most insidiously, perfectionism masquerades as a commitment to quality. It feels responsible, professional, and admirable. This makes it particularly difficult to recognize as a form of self-sabotage. Yet research consistently shows that teams and individuals who embrace iterative improvement consistently outperform those striving for initial perfection. The alternative isn't lowered standards, but a fundamental shift in how we pursue excellence. Studies in expertise development reveal that mastery emerges through engagement with progressive challenges, where each attempt builds upon the lessons of the last. This creates an upward spiral of improvement that perfectionism actually prevents. The psychological safety created by accepting imperfect action allows for the very innovation and creativity that perfectionism stifles. When we remove the pressure of perfect execution, we free our minds to explore, experiment, and discover solutions we could never have planned in advance. Your pursuit of excellence isn't the problem. It's the assumption that excellence requires perfection that creates the trap. The most profound achievements in human history emerge through countless iterations, adjustments, and improvements. The Wright brothers didn't wait until they could build a perfect airplane. They started with basic gliders and progressively refined their design through repeated attempts. The path to exceptional results requires embracing what psychologists call productive failure, the valuable learning that comes from imperfect attempts. This creates a foundation of practical experience that theoretical perfection can never provide. When you find yourself stuck in perfectionist patterns, notice how this mindset serves as a shield from potential judgment or criticism. Ask yourself, what specifically am I protecting myself from by waiting for perfect conditions? What would become possible if I allowed myself to begin before feeling fully ready? Excellence isn't the absence of flaws, but the presence of continuous improvement. As this understanding deepens, you'll begin seeing how the next chapter's exploration of unnecessary complexity often intertwines with perfectionist tendencies, creating additional layers of resistance that require attention. Chapter 12. The Complexity Bias. You spend hours meticulously crafting the perfect productivity system. Multiple apps synchronize across devices. Color-coded categories designate task priorities. Complex workflows map every conceivable scenario. The system itself becomes a masterpiece of intricate planning, while the actual work remains untouched. This tendency to gravitate toward complex solutions reveals a fascinating quirk of human psychology. Our minds instinctively equate complexity with value, sophistication, and effectiveness. When faced with a challenge, we automatically begin constructing elaborate frameworks rather than considering simpler approaches. This complexity bias runs so deep that we often reject straightforward solutions precisely because they seem too easy. The evolutionary roots of this bias trace back to our ancestors' need to demonstrate intelligence and capability through creative problem solving. In a social species where cognitive abilities significantly influence survival and reproduction, the capacity to generate complex solutions served as a fitness indicator. This ancient programming persists in our modern context, leading us to unconsciously favor intricacy over simplicity, even when it works against our interests. Research in behavioral economics consistently demonstrates how this bias influences decision-making across all domains. When presented with both simple and complex solutions to identical problems, people consistently rate the more complicated approach as more likely to succeed, even when objective measures show the opposite. This cognitive distortion creates a particularly challenging barrier in productivity, where unnecessary complexity adds friction that prevents action. Consider the Rube Goldberg machines, those famously overcomplicated contraptions that use dozens of interconnected steps to perform simple tasks, like cracking an egg or watering a plant. While entertaining as novelties, they perfectly illustrate how we often approach our own productivity challenges. We build elaborate systems of apps, rules, and workflows to accomplish what could be done with far simpler methods. The intellectual satisfaction of designing these complex systems masks their practical inefficiency. This complexity bias manifests in countless ways, creating unnecessarily detailed planning documents, establishing Byzantine tracking systems, or developing multi-stage protocols for basic tasks. While these activities feel productive in the moment, they often serve as sophisticated forms of procrastination, allowing us to feel accomplished while avoiding the essential work itself. The true sophistication lies in simplicity. The most effective solutions often remove, rather than add, complexity. This principle appears repeatedly across disciplines, from engineering to martial arts to scientific theory, where mastery is demonstrated through identifying the most elegant, straightforward approach rather than the most elaborate one. Consider how nature itself tends toward efficiency. Water doesn't create complex pathways down a hill. It finds the simplest route available. Plants don't develop unnecessarily complicated systems for photosynthesis. They evolve the most efficient process possible. This natural tendency toward simplicity offers an important lesson about productivity. Complexity should never be mistaken for effectiveness. The psychological comfort of complexity comes from how it protects us from action. Elaborate systems provide the illusion of progress, while creating barriers that prevent actual engagement. Each additional layer of complexity adds another potential point of friction, another opportunity for resistance, another excuse for delay. When examining your own productivity approaches, notice where complexity might be serving as a shield rather than a tool. Are your systems actually supporting action, or are they creating beautiful but unnecessary obstacles? Have you rejected simpler solutions because they don't feel sophisticated enough? Is your planning becoming a substitute for doing? This isn't to suggest that all complex systems are inherently problematic. Some situations genuinely require detailed frameworks. The key lies in recognizing when complexity serves the goal versus when it serves avoidance. True productivity emerges from removing unnecessary complications rather than adding more sophisticated ones. The most powerful question becomes, what's the simplest way this could work? Not the most impressive way, not the most thorough way, but the most direct path between intention and action. This shift from complexity to simplicity often creates breakthrough moments where previously stuck projects suddenly become manageable. The solution to complexity bias isn't fighting against it, but becoming aware of its influence. Notice when your mind automatically gravitates toward complicated approaches. Question whether additional layers truly serve the goal or simply satisfy an unconscious bias toward intricacy. Remember that simplicity isn't a compromise. It's often the highest form of sophistication. Chapter 13. The Permission Principle. When you pause to examine your daily actions, you'll notice an intricate web of unwritten rules governing every aspect of your productivity. These invisible obligations silently shape how you approach work, creating unnecessary pressure and complexity. You feel compelled to respond to emails within hours, regardless of urgency. You believe tasks must be completed in one uninterrupted session. You impose rigid sequences on your workflow that no one actually requires. These self-imposed rules create a constant undercurrent of pressure and inadequacy. The weight of these phantom obligations affects everything from how you structure your day to how you gauge your own success. When you deviate from these internal mandates, guilt and anxiety surface, even though no external authority enforces these standards. The truth about these invisible obligations reveals a transformative insight. Most barriers to effortless action aren't external constraints, but self-imposed permissions we've never granted ourselves. Your mind has internalized countless shoulds that masquerade as absolute requirements, but actually exist only in your thoughts. Research in cognitive psychology demonstrates how these internal rules often originate from past experiences, authority figures, or misinterpreted social norms. A demanding parent's voice becomes your internal taskmaster. A former boss's preferences transform into universal laws. Cultural messages about proper work ethics crystallize into rigid commandments. Think of these self-imposed constraints as carrying a heavy rule book no one ever asked you to follow. Each page contains detailed regulations about how things must be done. Regulations you've written yourself but forgotten you authored. This rulebook adds weight to every action, creating resistance where none naturally exists. The security these rules provide is undeniable. Clear guidelines can reduce uncertainty and provide a sense of control. However, this security comes at the cost of flexibility, spontaneity, and natural flow. Many of these rules are simply habitual thoughts rather than requirements for success or acceptance. What makes these obligations particularly insidious is how they operate below conscious awareness. You may feel resistance to working in short bursts. without realizing you're enforcing an unwritten rule that real work requires long, uninterrupted blocks of time. You might experience anxiety about tackling tasks out of sequence without recognizing your self-imposed mandate that everything must be done in perfect order. The profound power of conscious permission-giving emerges as an antidote to these invisible obligations. By bringing these unconscious rules into awareness, you can actively choose which serve you and which create needless friction. You can grant yourself permission to work in ways that align with your natural rhythms rather than arbitrary standards. Consider how your relationship with tasks transforms when you consciously release unnecessary rules. An email can wait until tomorrow if no urgent response is truly required. A project can progress through multiple small sessions rather than one marathon effort. Work can flow in the sequence that feels most natural, rather than following rigid protocols. The liberation that comes from releasing these invisible obligations extends beyond immediate productivity. It creates space for innovation, allowing you to discover more effective approaches that may have been blocked by rigid rules. It reduces the emotional drain of constant self-judgment against arbitrary standards. This shift requires recognizing that most permissions you seek can only come from yourself. No external authority can grant you the freedom to work differently if you haven't first released your own internal constraints. The weight of the rule book lifts only when you consciously choose to set it down. Each should you carry deserves examination. Does it serve your true objectives or merely perpetuate patterns of unnecessary strain? Does it arise from genuine requirements or internalized voices that no longer reflect your current reality? Most importantly, what possibilities might open up if you granted yourself permission to work differently? Productivity transforms when filtered through this lens of self-granted permission. Actions flow more naturally when freed from the friction of phantom obligations. The energy previously spent enforcing arbitrary rules becomes available for actual progress. Your relationship with work shifts from rigid compliance to fluid response. Rather than constantly monitoring yourself against an imagined standard, you move with intuitive grace toward what matters most. Tasks that once felt heavy with the weight of external expectations now carry only their true importance. You discover a natural rhythm, one that emerges from your authentic priorities rather than borrowed beliefs about how work should be done. Chapter 14. The Environment Effect. You've likely experienced moments when productivity seemed effortless. Perhaps while working at your favorite cafe, where ideas flowed naturally and tasks practically completed themselves. Yet in other spaces, like your home office, similar tasks feel impossibly heavy, despite your unchanged capabilities and motivation level. This stark contrast in your ability to take action across different environments reveals a profound truth about productivity that most people overlook. Your physical and digital environment shape your behavior far more powerfully than you realize, creating either friction or flow in your relationship with action. This influence operates largely outside conscious awareness, subtly guiding your choices and behaviors through countless environmental cues that your brain processes automatically. Research in environmental psychology has revealed how deeply our surroundings affect our cognitive function, emotional state, and behavioral patterns. Studies show that our brains constantly scan environments for cues about what actions are appropriate or easy in that context, often bypassing conscious decision-making entirely. Small environmental factors, like the height of your desk, the distance to your phone, or the number of clicks required to access a digital tool, create either subtle invitation or resistance to specific actions. Think of your interaction with any environment like swimming in a body of water. In an environment aligned with your intended actions, you move forward with minimal effort, carried by the current of thoughtful design. But in an environment working against you, even simple actions require constant energy and attention, like swimming upstream against a strong current. The amount of effort you're capable of exerting hasn't changed, but the environment dramatically affects how far that effort takes you. This understanding reveals an extraordinary opportunity. Through conscious environmental design, you can eliminate many sources of resistance before they ever arise. Rather than relying on willpower to overcome environmental friction, you can create spaces where desired actions become the path of least resistance. Consider how digital environments shape behavior just as powerfully as physical ones. The layout of your computer desktop, the organization of your files, the accessibility of your tools. All these factors create either seamless flow or subtle barriers to action. Even the default settings on your devices act as invisible forces guiding your behavior in specific directions. The power of environmental design as a productivity tool often goes unrecognized precisely because it works invisibly. Unlike motivation techniques or time management systems that demand constant conscious attention, well-designed environments silently guide behavior in desired directions without requiring ongoing effort. This principle explains why the same person can be remarkably productive in one setting while feeling completely blocked in another. It's not about the person changing, it's about the environment either supporting or hindering their natural tendency toward action. The most effective environments aren't necessarily the most elaborate or aesthetically pleasing. They're the ones that remove unnecessary friction between intention and action. Sometimes this means eliminating options rather than adding features, reducing complexity rather than increasing it. Look at your current physical and digital workspaces through this lens. Notice how certain elements either invite or inhibit specific actions. That stack of papers in your peripheral vision, the notifications constantly pulling at your attention, the multi-step process required to access important tools, each creates subtle friction that adds up to significant resistance over time. The most powerful environmental changes often feel deceptively simple. Moving your phone to another room while working, pre-positioning tools needed for morning tasks the night before, organizing digital files so key projects are one click away instead of three. These small adjustments can dramatically reduce the cognitive and emotional friction around taking action. Your environment isn't just a backdrop for your actions. It's an active force shaping them. By recognizing this influence and designing spaces thoughtfully, you can create conditions where productive action becomes the natural, effortless choice, rather than a constant battle against resistance. This understanding transforms productivity from a matter of personal discipline into an exercise in environmental design. Instead of asking, "How can I force myself to be more productive?" the question becomes, "How can I design my environment so the actions I want to take become the easiest ones to take?" By shifting focus from willpower to workspace, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of self-judgment and internal battles. Your energy flows naturally toward creating supportive structures rather than fighting against resistant ones. This subtle but profound reframing places the power back in your hands, transforming you from someone struggling against your environment into its intentional architect. When you recognize that your surroundings shape your choices as much as your willpower does, you gain access to an entirely new dimension of personal growth. The battle is no longer about forcing yourself to overcome obstacles. It's about removing those obstacles entirely and creating pathways that guide you toward your goals with minimal resistance. Chapter 15. The Minimum Viable Action. Think back to a moment when an important task loomed before you, feeling impossibly large. Perhaps it was writing a book, launching a business, or simply organizing your workspace. The weight of the complete goal felt crushing, until you identified an action so small, it seemed almost meaningless. Maybe you committed to writing just one sentence, making a single phone call, or clearing a tiny corner of your desk. In that moment, something fascinating happened. That ridiculously small action, once completed, created a subtle shift. The resistance that had felt so overwhelming began to dissolve. One sentence became a paragraph. The single phone call led to scheduling several meetings. The cleared corner expanded to encompass the entire desk. This phenomenon reveals one of the most powerful yet counterintuitive principles of human behavior: the minimum viable action, MVA. The MVA represents the smallest possible step that moves you from complete inaction into motion. It's deliberately designed to be so minimal that it bypasses your brain's natural resistance mechanisms through its very simplicity. The science behind this principle is fascinating. Research in behavioral psychology has shown that our brains process large tasks as potential threats, triggering our limbic system's protective responses. However, actions small enough to seem trivial slip beneath this threat detection radar. Once we begin moving, even in the smallest way, powerful psychological mechanisms of consistency and commitment take over. Moreover, neuroscience has revealed that the perception of effort dramatically changes once we're in motion. The same task that felt overwhelming before taking that tiny first step suddenly becomes manageable once we're engaged. This isn't just positive thinking, it's a measurable shift in brain activation patterns. Think of starting a task like moving a massive boulder. The initial force required to overcome static friction is substantial. However, once the boulder begins rolling, it requires far less energy to maintain its motion. The key insight isn't to push harder, but to reduce the initial force required by making the first action impossibly small. You might resist this approach, believing that such tiny steps couldn't possibly lead to meaningful progress. Yet paradoxically, microscopic commitments often create more substantial results than ambitious initial goals. When you commit to writing just one sentence, you're more likely to complete an entire chapter than if you sit down intending to write for hours. This principle works because it aligns with your brain's natural functioning rather than fighting against it. It acknowledges that resistance isn't a character flaw to overcome, but a natural protective mechanism to work around. By choosing actions so small they don't trigger this protective response, you create a path of least resistance toward your goals. The MVA approach synthesizes everything we've explored about perception, resistance, and momentum. It addresses the weight illusion by making tasks feel lighter through their reduced size. It bypasses your brain's automatic response to change by presenting actions too small to register as threatening. It dissolves the paralysis of perfectionism by making starting so simple that excellence becomes irrelevant to initiation. Consider your most resisted task right now. What would be the smallest possible action you could take toward it? Make it so tiny it seems almost laughable. Instead of start exercising, try put on one running shoe. Rather than begin the project, consider open the document and type one word. The key is to identify an action so minimal that the usual voices of resistance have nothing to grip onto. This approach might seem to contradict conventional wisdom about setting ambitious goals and pushing through resistance. However, this isn't about lowering your standards or avoiding challenges. It's about understanding that the path to massive action often begins with microscopic movement. The MVA principle reveals that the gap between inaction and action is more significant than the gap between small action and large action. Once you're in motion, expanding that action happens naturally. The crucial moment isn't when you're taking massive action. It's that tiny shift from zero to something, no matter how small. Ultimately, this understanding liberates you from the tyranny of overwhelming goals while paradoxically making their achievement more likely. It transforms the daunting question, "How can I accomplish this massive task?" into the manageable, "What's the smallest step I could take right now?" The most profound changes often begin with the smallest actions. A journey of 1,000 miles doesn't just begin with a single step. It begins with lifting your foot slightly off the ground. That microscopic movement contains within it the potential for every step that follows. Chapter 16. The Identity Shift. You've likely experienced those surprising moments when taking action felt different, lighter, more natural, almost inevitable. Perhaps you found yourself automatically starting that morning workout without the usual internal debate, or tackling work projects with a new sense of flow. In these moments, something fundamental had shifted. The change wasn't in the actions themselves, but in how you perceived yourself in relation to them. This transformation in self-concept represents one of the most powerful, yet understudied aspects of sustainable productivity. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that when actions align with our identity, they require significantly less willpower and conscious effort. The brain expends considerable energy maintaining consistency between our behaviors and self-image, making actions that match our identity feel natural, while those that contradict it create emotional friction. Consider how water shapes landscapes over time. Initially, water meets significant resistance as it flows across untouched terrain. But with each pass, it carves slightly deeper channels. Eventually, these channels become so well defined that they naturally direct the flow of future water. Your actions follow a similar pattern. Each time you take action, you're carving neural and psychological pathways that make similar actions increasingly natural. Modern neuroscience reveals that identity isn't fixed but remarkably plastic, continuously shaped by our behaviors and experiences. When you consistently take even small actions, your brain updates its model of who you are, gradually incorporating these behaviors into your core identity. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Actions shape identity, which then makes those actions feel more natural, leading to more consistent action. The conventional approach to productivity often focuses on forcing behaviors that feel misaligned with our current identity, creating constant internal resistance. But research on identity-based habits shows that sustainable change comes from gradually evolving our self-concept through consistent small actions. Rather than trying to force yourself to become a productive person overnight, you can intentionally cultivate this identity through progressive experience. The language you use to describe yourself plays a crucial role in this evolution. Phrases like, "I'm becoming someone who," or "I'm developing into," create psychological space for growth without triggering identity defense mechanisms. This subtle linguistic shift acknowledges both your current reality and your emerging potential. Looking at your own experience, you can likely identify areas where your identity has already evolved naturally through repeated action. Perhaps you once saw yourself as not a morning person, but gradually became someone who rises early without resistance. Or maybe you transformed from bad with technology to confidently handling digital tasks. These natural evolutions demonstrate your capacity for identity change. The power of identity alignment becomes particularly evident when examining productivity challenges. When you see yourself as someone who procrastinates, each attempt to take immediate action creates internal conflict. But as you begin seeing yourself as someone who takes action, similar behaviors feel increasingly natural and aligned. This shift goes beyond simple habit formation. While habits operate at the behavioral level, identity changes transform your fundamental relationship with action. You're not just doing productive things. You're becoming someone for whom productivity is a natural expression of who they are. This evolution doesn't require massive changes or declarations. Just as water shapes rock through persistent small flows rather than occasional floods, your identity evolves through consistent small actions rather than dramatic transformations. Each tiny step taken strengthens your emerging identity as someone who takes action. By understanding this relationship between identity and action, you can work with your brain's natural tendency toward consistency rather than fighting against it. Instead of using willpower to force actions that feel misaligned with your current self-image, you can focus on gradually evolving your identity through progressive experience. The key lies in recognizing that identity isn't something you choose intellectually. It's something you build through action. Every time you take even a small step forward, you're not just completing a task. You're reinforcing an emerging identity as someone who moves from intention to action naturally and consistently. This represents a fundamental shift in how we approach productivity. Rather than focusing solely on what we do, we begin paying attention to who we're becoming through our actions. This identity-based approach creates sustainable change by aligning our behaviors with our evolving self-concept, making productivity feel less like a constant struggle and more like a natural expression of who we are. As your identity shifts, you'll notice a corresponding change in how actions feel. Tasks that once required significant emotional energy begin feeling more natural. The internal resistance that previously accompanied action starts to dissolve. You find yourself taking action not because you're forcing yourself, but because it feels like a genuine expression of who you're becoming. You become your actions, and then your actions become effortless. This cycle represents the deepest level of productivity transformation, where doing flows naturally from being, and resistance dissolves in the face of identity alignment. Chapter 17. The Recovery Principle. You notice it immediately, that sinking feeling when you miss a day of your new morning routine. The familiar voice of self-judgment begins its well-worn critique, ready to declare the entire endeavor a failure. But something feels different this time. Instead of spiraling into extended self-recrimination or abandoning the habit entirely, you simply take a small step forward. This subtle but profound shift in response to setbacks represents one of the most crucial elements of sustainable productivity. The psychology of setbacks reveals a fascinating pattern. It's rarely the initial failure that derails progress, but rather our response to that failure that determines its ultimate impact. Research in behavioral psychology shows that the duration of actual setbacks is typically far shorter than the extended recovery periods we create through rumination and negative self-talk. Studies of high performers across multiple fields consistently demonstrate that their superiority lies not in failing less frequently, but in recovering more rapidly from inevitable setbacks. This insight challenges the conventional wisdom about resilience. The key to sustained productivity isn't developing an immunity to failure or achieving perfect consistency. It's minimizing the gap between setback and recovery. Just as physical wounds heal faster with immediate attention, psychological setbacks have less impact when addressed promptly, rather than allowed to fester. Consider how you respond to stumbling while walking. You don't typically remain on the ground contemplating your failure as a walker or questioning whether you should continue the journey. You simply stand up and continue forward. Yet with productivity setbacks, we often engage in extended periods of self-recrimination that transform momentary stumbles into prolonged interruptions. The neuroscience of habit formation supports this approach to rapid recovery. Research shows that neural pathways associated with habits don't disappear after short interruptions. They merely become temporarily dormant. Quick re-engagement prevents these pathways from degrading while reinforcing the brain's pattern recognition of setbacks as temporary states rather than permanent conditions. This process of immediate recovery becomes particularly powerful when viewed through the lens of identity maintenance. When we interpret setbacks as information rather than identity markers, we create psychological space for immediate re-engagement. The setback becomes a data point about our process rather than a referendum on our character or capabilities. This perspective shift transforms how we experience productivity interruptions. Instead of viewing them as evidence of fundamental flaws or lack of commitment, we can recognize them as natural variations in the ongoing flow of action. This recognition allows us to respond with curiosity rather than judgment, examining what we might learn while maintaining forward momentum. Studies in cognitive behavioral therapy demonstrate that this approach, separating events from their interpretation, significantly reduces the emotional impact of setbacks while accelerating recovery time. By questioning our automatic narratives about what setbacks mean, we can prevent brief interruptions from becoming extended productivity gaps. The skill of rapid recovery improves with deliberate practice. Each time you quickly re-engage after a setback, you're strengthening neural pathways that support resilience while weakening old patterns of rumination and abandonment. This creates a positive feedback loop where faster recovery leads to greater confidence, which in turn supports even faster recovery in future instances. Organizations studying high-performance teams have found that groups who normalize rapid recovery consistently outperform those who emphasize perfect execution. The ability to quickly bounce back creates psychological safety that actually reduces error rates while increasing innovation and sustained engagement. The path to mastering rapid recovery begins with recognizing that setbacks provide opportunities to practice this crucial skill. Each interruption offers a choice point, a moment to either engage in familiar patterns of extended recovery or to experiment with immediate re-engagement, no matter how small the step forward might be. This approach aligns with research on psychological momentum, which shows that even minimal forward movement can interrupt negative spirals and initiate positive progression. The specific action taken matters far less than the speed with which it occurs. Any step forward, however small, can serve as a pattern interrupt that prevents extended derailment. The implications of this understanding extend beyond individual moments of recovery. By developing rapid recovery as a core skill, you create a foundation for sustained productivity that's resilient to life's inevitable disruptions. This resilience comes not from becoming impervious to setbacks, but from knowing that you can and will bounce back quickly when they occur. Chapter 18. The Flow Formula. When all elements align, you experience moments where action flows without the familiar weight of resistance. Tasks that once felt heavy become light. Decisions that used to paralyze now resolve naturally. Actions that previously required immense willpower emerge spontaneously. These glimpses of effortless productivity reveal what's possible when we remove the perceptual barriers between intention and action. This state of flow isn't achieved through greater force or discipline. Rather, it emerges naturally when several key elements work in harmony. Just as water flows effortlessly downhill when obstacles are removed, your natural state is one of productive engagement, once you clear the path. The elements we've explored throughout this journey work together synergistically to create the conditions for effortless action. When perception aligns with reality rather than distorting it, tasks lose their artificial weight. When identity evolves to embrace action rather than resist it, movement becomes natural rather than forced. When environments support rather than hinder, friction dissolves before it can arise. When momentum builds through tiny steps, action perpetuates itself. These elements form what we might call the flow formula. Not a rigid system, but a framework for understanding how different aspects of our relationship with action interact. Each element reinforces the others, creating either virtuous or vicious cycles in our productivity experience. Consider how a shift in perception ripples through the other elements. When you recognize that a task's weight exists in perception rather than reality, resistance diminishes. This makes taking action easier, which builds positive momentum. As you act consistently, your identity naturally evolves. As your identity shifts, environments that support action feel more congruent. As supportive environments reduce friction, perception continues to align more closely with reality. This compound effect works in both directions. When perception distorts reality, resistance increases. Increased resistance makes action harder, reducing momentum. Reduced momentum prevents identity evolution. Static identity maintains friction-filled environments. Friction-filled environments reinforce distorted perceptions. The power of the flow formula lies in its holistic nature. Trying to force productivity through willpower alone ignores how these elements interact. It's like trying to make water flow uphill through sheer force, rather than removing the obstacles in its natural path downward. Understanding these interactions reveals why traditional productivity advice often falls short. Tips and techniques that address only one element while ignoring the others create temporary results at best. Real transformation requires working with the entire system of our relationship with action. This doesn't mean you need to revolutionize every element simultaneously. Small shifts in each area create space for shifts in others. As perception starts to align with reality, identity has room to evolve. As identity evolves, environments naturally transform. As environments transform, momentum builds more easily. As momentum builds, perception continues to clarify. The key is recognizing that your current productivity patterns reflect the interaction of all these elements, rather than any single factor. This broader perspective allows you to identify your highest leverage opportunities for creating more flow. What's your current relationship with each element? Where do you notice the most distortion in perception? Which aspects of identity create the most resistance? How do your environments support or hinder action? Where does momentum tend to break down? The answers reveal your unique path to more effortless productivity. Rather than forcing yourself to follow someone else's system, you can work with your specific patterns to create the conditions where action flows naturally. This brings us full circle to the core premise. Productivity struggles don't reflect character defects requiring force to overcome. They reflect temporary misalignments between elements that can be gently adjusted to allow your natural state of productive engagement to emerge. Flow isn't something you achieve through effort. It's what happens naturally when you remove the barriers between intention and action. When perception aligns with reality, identity embraces action, environments support engagement, and momentum builds through small steps. Productivity becomes less about pushing yourself and more about allowing your natural inclination toward meaningful action to express itself. This natural state awaits as you begin integrating these elements in your own unique way. The path opens not through force, but through progressive alignment, creating space for action to flow as effortlessly as water finding its way downstream. Conclusion. Throughout this journey, we've explored a revolutionary truth. Your productivity struggles don't stem from character flaws or lack of discipline. They emerge from distorted perceptions that create artificial weight and resistance around action. This understanding transforms everything, shifting focus from forcing yourself to work harder, to removing the invisible barriers that make work feel hard in the first place. We began by examining how perception creates unnecessary weight through the weight illusion, where tasks feel heavier than they actually are. We discovered how the brain's automatic response to change creates resistance that feels real, but isn't necessary. We exposed the dangerous myth that motivation must precede action, revealing instead how action generates the very energy and motivation we've been waiting for. Our exploration continued through understanding how procrastination warps time perception, making avoided tasks seem far more daunting than reality. We broke free from the all-or-nothing trap that creates artificial productivity cliffs. We examined how self-concept creates or dissolves resistance, and how society's achievement obsession adds unnecessary layers of complexity to our relationship with action. We identified the hidden anxieties beneath procrastination and mapped unique resistance patterns. We saw how perfectionism paradoxically leads to mediocrity and why our minds gravitate toward complicated solutions when simplicity would serve better. We released ourselves from invisible obligations and learned to design environments that eliminate friction rather than create it. Through the power of tiny steps in identity evolution, we discovered how small actions create massive momentum when perception aligns with reality. We developed resilience through rapid recovery from setbacks, and finally synthesized all elements into a natural state of flow. This journey has never been about adding new techniques or forcing yourself to work harder. It's been about removing the perceptual barriers that make action feel harder than it needs to be. Like water naturally flowing downhill when obstacles are removed, your natural state is one of productive engagement. Once you clear the path, this perceptual work continues as a lifelong journey. Perfection isn't required or even helpful. Each small shift in how you see action creates compounding benefits as new neural pathways establish themselves. Your capacity for effortless action grows not through superhuman discipline, but through progressively clearing away the artificial weight that perception has added to simple tasks. You've begun a revolution in how you perceive action itself, from something you must force yourself to do, to something you allow to happen naturally when the path is clear. This transformation doesn't require you to become someone else or develop extraordinary willpower. It simply invites you to see action as it truly is, without the distorting lens of perception adding unnecessary weight. The infinite productivity hack isn't a technique at all. It's the profound realization that action becomes effortless when we stop adding weight to it through perception. Your true nature is one of purposeful engagement. As you continue removing the barriers between intention and action, you'll find that productivity isn't something you achieve through force. It's what emerges naturally when you get out of your own way. Thank you for listening and for investing in yourself. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now go out there and create the life you deserve. Self. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now go out there and create the life you deserve.